So, impulse responses, what are they? Imagine if you could sample a space or the sound characteristics of a piece of equipment, like an amp. So you might be asking, what's the point? Because our manufacturers provide us with so many presets of immaculately sampled or recorded acoustic spaces such as churches or concert halls. You might be asking, can I even get very close to those results? Well, if you had very accurate speakers, very accurate mics, and all the time in the world, you could probably do it. I think what's more interesting is to actually record or sample unique spaces or the sound of unique equipment. So what I'll be concentrating on today is how to create an impulse response out of one of my favorite little amps, which I use a lot for reamping. Let me take you closer. So one of the great things about this little amp is it's sort of in a position in the room I really like. It's very cheap, very modest, but you can see here I've got a little reamp box which simply takes the impedance back to high Z from a line level. I've got a little Sennheiser mic. It's an E609. I really like the way that sounds right in front of the speaker. So what I normally do, if I record anything in DI form, like this guitar, or this Rhodes, or the clavinet sound from this Rhodes Electro, I tend to then reamp it and record it. But A, this amp sounds very different in this room and I like it, and I want to take it away with me. B, it saves me from having to actually run audio in real time out into the amp and back in. So creating an impulse response of this amp is very useful for the purposes of amplifying DI'd instruments, and it's very helpful as a sample-based recreation mechanism as well. So now one of the benefits of this technique is that you don't actually depend on a high-quality speaker on a high-quality microphone. When you're trying to record or sample spaces, you really try to get the speaker to be non-colorful, and you try to get the microphone to be very, very accurate. That's so when you deconvolve or create an impulse response, that any coloration that came from the speaker or the microphone isn't part of it. But in the case of this little amp and this little microphone, what I'm actually trying to create is exactly the coloration of that combo. So here's what we have to do. In order to create an impulse response, I'm going to use the inbuilt impulse response utility that lives within Logic Pro X and specifically within the Space Designer. The easiest way to access the IR utilities from the Space Designer, if you open up the Load IR menu and then open the IR utility. From the top left of the IR utility menus, choose the interface you want to use as your input and output options. You can see I've chosen Universal Audio Thunderbolt for both here, but you choose the interface that corresponds to your system. The sample rate variable is locked to your song or project settings. You can experiment with the waveform, energy or spectrogram menus to look at your impulse responses in different ways. So the idea behind creating impulse responses is to energize a space, as I was saying before, with a short impact sound. This could be a starting gun or it could be a burst balloon. The problem is, of course, how do you energize a large space with enough volume with such a short sound? The idea of the deconvolve process is to take that sound away and be left with the rest. So if you could apply that to any other sound, you would get the effect of that sound existing in that space. But although such impact sounds can create a certain amount of success, and there's been some great impulse responses as a result, the sweep of a sound wave going from the real subsonics to dog whistle highs is maybe a more accurate way of energizing a room. However, that requires a mathematical or algorithmic process where the sound wave sweep is then deconvolved, in fact erased or reversed, so we are only left with the effect on the room or the speaker or the amp. So what I'll do here is I'll create the right settings for the sweep. You have to be careful to avoid feedback. So my speakers are now off, they're muted here. The microphone is not being monitored, and I'm going to turn the amp on. First, we need to check whether we're getting any sound. So I'm going to use the 1 kHz tone and make sure that the level is not too hot, but it's loud enough in order to energize the amp and the microphone. You can also test different tones to see if your speaker maybe distorts at a different frequency. Just below the display you have track recording settings, and once you enable the record button and select the right input, some of the variables on the left will become available. A 10-second sweep is a good starting point for the sine wave sweep, but I'm going to reduce the reverb time in this case to only 1 second, because I'm trying to record an amp and not the tail or reverb or decay of a large space. You are now ready to record the sweep. Experiment with your settings until you get optimum level, so you want it loud but not distorted. Now, because you were using a sweep and not an impact sound, you want to hit deconvolve. This is when the maths take over and you will be left with the response of the equipment. The result should be looking like a burst or an impact sound, but you may see some latency because of your recording setup. So you want to drag with your pointer in the display window and hit cut. You are now ready to create your first setting. Click on Create Setting at the bottom of the utility and fill in the desired name for your Space Designer setting. You will get a pop-up menu saying SDIR or Sound Designer Impulse Response file created. Your new setting will now appear under the Space Designer presets. Select it, but be careful to switch around the settings to fully wet and not dry. If you've created impulse responses for your favorite cabinet, it might be an idea to use that in combination with the preamps available inside the Amp Designer in Logic. What you have to do inside the Amp Designer is select Direct instead of the cabinet and insert Space Designer with your setting straight after the Amp Designer plugin. The result will be the sound of your source going through a preamp and then going through the speaker that you have recreated. Creating impulse responses out of favorite bits of equipment, like my trusty little Vox amp, is a great way to speed up reamping and a great way to bring the vintage into the sample-based recreation process. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to Hip Hop Time Machine episode 6. It's been a while as I took a trip to the roots of all this, some exciting and historic studios in the US. These places and the people in them were responsible for pioneering early blues and rock and roll recordings and stylizing the use of space on mixes. The sonic choices made by the Chess Brothers in Chicago and Sam Phillips in Memphis and the performances they got out of their artists paved the way for a lot of what we regard as popular music. I learned a lot from seeing and hearing the equipment and the spaces and talking to people on the sonic adventure. But that will be the focus of many future episodes. Today, I want to stay on the notion of space and its ambient manifestations within a mix. Remember, this was the missing link in our drum mixing adventures from episodes 3 and 4. For anyone who has grown up in the era of plugins or even digital reverb units, the illusion of space within a mix may seem like a really easily attainable sonic characteristic. Insert a reverb effect on a channel or bus, dial in some room, hall or plate reverb, Give it some aux or dry wet decibels and off you go. Your dry, close-mic'd sources now sound like they're in Royal Albert Hall. Yet there was a time when if you wanted the feeling of space around your instruments, you actually had to capture it. Capture the reflections from room surfaces, let the sources bleed on adjacent mics, or send all your recordings to an actual echo chamber. What is that? Well, it should really be called a reverberation chamber, but the name sounded way cooler like that, so it stuck. So a reverb chamber was a separate reverberant room, sometimes purposely built, sometimes just a lavatory or staircase, where the engineers would place as good a speaker as possible, send the previously made recordings to it, then record the results of the direct sounds blending with the room reflections at the other end of the room. Bringing this back to the mix and balancing it against the previously made recordings not only made them sound like they were recorded in a larger recording space, but it also made them blend better, and it made the mix glue more effectively. But why not record in a larger space in the first instance? Well, for starters, not everybody had access to large recording spaces. Even studios and recordings that are now revered were made under less than ideal circumstances. Independent producers using DIY techniques, abusing early, inadequate technology in hotel rooms, offices, and converted spaces. Chess Records was a converted car showroom. Sound's live room was at the back of Sam Phillips' office. And J&M Music Studio in New Orleans, well, that's now a laundrette. It's also a question of control. Being able to blend detail and accuracy against epicness. Finding out about the DIY techniques behind many of the records I love gave me the courage to attempt it myself, resorting to the infamous bathroom chamber with its hard reflective surfaces. Here's the recipe. 1 good studio monitor, a good condenser mic, enough space and distance to generate reflections, an interface that can send pre-recorded audio to the speaker, and that can record what the bathroom mic picks up at the same time. It's worth experimenting with different angles on both the speaker and the mic, as well as different mic polarities, to capture maximum reflections but also a pleasing frequency response. I was also considering what sort of combinations of the recorded instruments I should send, all at the same time, individually, before any EQ or compression, or after. In the name of research, I tried them all so I could experiment in the mix. My favorite option was to use individual, unprocessed recordings, which philosophically is a little bit closer to what would have happened to the original sources had they been recorded in a space like that. Bringing this back to the mix added a very interesting depth and texture to the bass, piano, drums and harp. It also felt more original, authentic and unique than any commercially available reverb signatures, which fits with the retro vibe pursued on this hip-hop time machine. The instruments that had been recorded in different rooms or DI'd were also brought into the same space, creating coherency for the mix. The final touch was to bring in an era-specific plate reverb to the equation in order to separate the harp a little bit and give it a special character. The EMT 140 was built in 1958 and UAD make a really good emulation of it. The final mix here features the drum mixing from previous episodes, plus a little bit of additional mixing on the bass, piano and harp. There are also some processors on the mix bass, emulating a late 1950s workflow and signal flow. But these are topics for future episodes. See you soon.